Before a child can even be known, a tiny birth certificate is already waiting, and that one sheet of paper may have changed far more than just a name. For most of human history, empires rose and fell without demanding a numbered paper for every baby. Families, churches, and local communities handled identity. Then, in a surprisingly short span, industrial nations began treating birth registration as necessary, and the shift came with almost eerie consistency. Public health was the official reason: infant deaths, disease tracking, and cleaner statistics. That explanation is real, but it may not be the whole story. Because once governments have the birth record, they could attach taxes, schooling, military service, and welfare to the same starting point. In that sense, the certificate was never just a notice of birth. It became the first anchor in a larger administrative chain. In the United States, the process accelerated around 1902 when the Census Bureau began building a national birth registration system. At first it was voluntary, but states had to prove high registration rates to enter the system. That kind of incentive changes behavior quickly. By 1915, only a handful of states were fully inside the framework. By 1933, every state had joined. The pace was remarkable, and that same era brought the Federal Reserve, the income tax, and draft requirements. Different policies, one tightly connected architecture. In 1913, federal income tax became permanent. That same year, Federal Reserve institutions also took shape, reinforcing a new administrative era. A birth record made these systems easier to verify because age, identity, and citizenship could now be checked against a single file. Here is the strange distinction few people notice. In law, a human being and a legal person are not always treated the same way. A human is biological. A legal person is a recognized administrative entity. The certificate may be the bridge between those two worlds. Once that bridge exists, the state can issue numbers, attach obligations, and follow a person through every major institution. That means taxes become easier, but so does military service. A birth record turns age into something a government can verify at scale. When millions of people can be sorted by paper, a state does not just know who exists. It knows who can be called, counted, and collected. And this is where the theory sharpens. If the system were only about health, why did it integrate so perfectly with every other arm of government? The documents appear administrative, but their reach is cultural too. They shift identity away from family memory and into state memory. A village once knew you because neighbors knew your parents. A church knew your baptism. A town knew your house and your name. Then the state took over that role. You were no longer primarily the remembered child of a community. You were the recorded subject of an office. Britain, France, Germany, Australia, and Canada all moved in this direction within a narrow historical window. Different languages, similar machinery. That similarity is why the question lingers. Was this simply parallel reform, or did one administrative idea spread farther than the public ever noticed? However it began, the result is clear today. Identity now starts with registration, and that registration quietly shapes almost every major interaction. And if birth papers can reshape a life, the next question is what other records quietly rebuilt the world around us. In 1837, Britain created the General Register Office, and with it, the modern habit of recording births as a state function. It looked administrative, almost harmless. But the office itself was not the real story. The real change came when governments realized a birth record could become a legal anchor for everything that followed. A child's first registration did more than note a name and date. It quietly turned a living person into an official entry that could be tracked, counted, and managed. By the early 1900s, industrial nations were moving in the same direction. Birth registration stopped being optional and began to look like infrastructure. Public health was the explanation, and it was not invented out of nowhere. Infant mortality, disease tracking, and maternal data all gave officials a practical reason to collect names. Still, the pattern went far beyond medical bookkeeping. Once a birth was recorded, it became easier to attach taxes, schooling, and identity to that same entry. That is where the system becomes more interesting. It no longer describes life, it starts organizing life around itself. In the United States, the push accelerated around 1902. When a federal birth registration area began to take shape, the system was voluntary at first, but only barely. By 1950, only a small group of states had joined. Then, in less than 20 years, the entire country had folded into the same framework, and the timing is what makes people pause. Federal Reserve, income tax, draft registration, and later Social Security all began tightening around the same era. If you were born into that framework, your birth paper became the first key in a long chain of records. Without it, later systems had far less to hold on to. That is why the legal distinction matters so much. A living person existed in the world, but the state needed a recorded person to operate efficiently. That shift made taxes easier to collect and age easier to prove. It also made military drafts, school enrollment, and welfare systems far more precise. But here is the real question. When the paperwork becomes this powerful, who is actually in control? So the question is not whether birth registration had a practical use. The real question is why it expanded with such unusual speed. A country can adopt a form for health reasons. It is harder to explain why that same form becomes the doorway to nearly every other form. What makes the archive so strange is the lack of a dramatic argument. There was no single public moment when everyone seemed to debate the philosophy of it. Instead, the change seems to have arrived as procedure. Clerks filled forms, offices copied them, and the habit spread quietly through the machinery of government. And once procedure becomes normal, resistance becomes rare. People adapt to the paperwork long before they notice what the paperwork is building. That may be the key to understanding old world heritage loss. When identity shifts from family memory to state archive, the past starts changing shape. A village once remembered a child through relatives, neighbors, and church lists. Later, that same child became a line inside a government file. That is not just a paperwork change. It is a rearrangement of who gets to define a person, a community, or a system. Once that happens, old heritage becomes easier to flatten. Names are standardized, dates are fixed, and local memory is overwritten by official consistency. Some researchers would say that is exactly what bureaucracy is built to do. It preserves order, but it also changes what survives. And that is why birth certificates matter so much in this story. They are not just about entering the world, they are about entering the system. And once that doorway opened, every later record could build on it. The next question is which other documents quietly inherited that same power. In 1902, the US Census Bureau began building a birth registration system that would eventually reach every state. At first, it looked modest and technical, but the system was never just about counting babies. It was about deciding which newborn life would become visible to the state and which would remain outside its paper trail. That change did not happen in one dramatic moment. It spread quietly across offices, ministries, and medical boards until the new habit felt inevitable. The real shift came when birth records stopped being local memory and started becoming national infrastructure. Once that happened, every later system could lean on the same first proof. In the beginning, many counties resisted. Clerks hesitated, parents ignored forms, and officials complained that the paperwork was too thin to change real life. Yet each refusal made the system more visible. To register births, the state first needed standardized forms, approved signatures, and the hierarchy of record keepers. That hierarchy mattered, because once a birth had to be validated by an office, the office gained authority over the very beginning of legal identity. By the time birth registration became universal, the paperwork no longer felt optional. It had become the first door through which the modern citizen had to pass. And once that door opened, other documents rushed in behind it: tax files, school forms, military records, and eventually the Social Security number. That is why birth certificates became more than records. They became the hinge point that allowed the state to connect a body to a file, and a file to a duty. And that connection had consequences. It made age provable, citizenship readable, and the drafting of young men far easier during wartime mobilization. No one needed a village memory when the file could speak for the person. No one needed a church ledger when the state wanted a clean chain of proof. This is where the system starts to look less like public health and more like administration by inheritance. Each document quietly borrowed authority from the one before it. In Britain, registration moved from parish habits to formal civil control in the 19th century. The language changed slowly, but the direction was unmistakable. France and Germany followed different legal traditions, yet they converged on the same idea: the newborn should be captured by paper before memory could fade. That convergence is what makes the story strange. Different governments, different laws, and yet the same bureaucratic instinct kept appearing in almost the same historical window. The official explanation says that was efficiency, better statistics, better public health, better administration. Those reasons exist, but they do not explain the speed. One registry could be useful, but when birth records began feeding taxation, conscription, schooling, and welfare, the certificate became something much larger. It became the proof that opened the rest of the machine. Without it, the later documents would have had nothing stable to stand on, and that is why some researchers treat the certificate as a boundary document, not just a record of birth, but a legal boundary between life and state recognition. Here is the uncomfortable part. Once a system begins at the cradle, it can accompany a person all the way to voting rolls, property, and death records. The 19th century had parish memory. The 20th century preferred paper permanence. That difference sounds small until the paper starts outranking the community. That is the real power of the birth certificate theory. It suggests the document did not merely register a child, it reorganized how modern states recognized existence itself. And once a state can define the beginning, it can more easily define everything that follows. That is the part of the story that still deserves closer attention, because if birth registration was the first layer, then the next layer may have been built with the same logic. What other records quietly inherited that power? In the late 1800s, officials began attaching numbers to newborns, not just names. That small administrative move would soon reshape how governments saw the child. At first, the paperwork was justified as public health, but once the forms existed, they could be used for far more than counting births. That is where the story turns. A certificate meant to record life could also organize labor, taxes, military duty, and inheritance. In Britain, civil registration became formal in 1837, but the system hardened much later. By then, records were no longer just notes. They were authority. France, Germany, Australia, and Canada moved in the same direction within a narrow historical window. Different states, same administrative obsession. What looks like local reform begins to resemble a shared pattern. And shared patterns always raise one uncomfortable question: who benefited first? Because the birth certificate did not stay isolated. It linked to census systems, then to taxes, then to conscription, then to schooling. A single record could now follow a person from cradle to grave. That made the child legible to institutions before the child ever had a voice. One theory is that this was never only about counting births. It was about converting human life into a sequence the state could process. By the early 1900s, the United States pushed registration harder through national standards. States that met the threshold were folded into the system. In 1913, the Federal Reserve appeared. In the same year, income tax became permanent. The paperwork age was expanding on every front. If you connect those dates, the certificate starts looking less like paperwork and more like infrastructure. Not decorative infrastructure, but functional control. That is why some researchers focus on the legal distinction between a living human and a registered person. The document creates the second category. Under that reading, the birth certificate is not a memory of arrival. It is the moment the state assigns an administrative identity. And once identity becomes administrative, it can be expanded endlessly. Schooling, licensing, travel, property, benefits, every door asks for the same first proof. By 1933, every US state had joined the birth registration framework. A process that began as voluntary had become a national norm. No one state changed the continent alone, but once the model proved useful, the logic spread through other industrial nations with surprising speed. That spread is what makes the topic so unsettling. Separate governments do not usually mirror one another that closely, without a powerful incentive. Some historians would say bureaucracy simply modernized. Others suggest the modern state needed a cleaner way to inventory people from birth onward. Here is the real hinge. Once a birth is documented, the rest of life can be authenticated against that first entry. Everything later borrows its legitimacy from it. That logic is why these records became so difficult to resist. If you challenge the birth file, you challenge the chain built on top of it. And that is why the old world heritage question matters here. Local memory once carried identity. Centralized records quietly replaced that inheritance. A family could be remembered by neighbors, priests, or town elders for centuries. Then one standardized form began deciding what counted as existence. If that sounds extreme, look at how many modern systems still begin with that first certificate. The document may be old, but its authority never left. So the deeper question is not whether birth certificates matter. It is what other records inherited the same quiet power, and which ones we still treat as harmless today. In the archive room, a stack of birth certificates sits under a single lamp, each one stamped, numbered, and treated like proof of existence. By the time the paper reaches a family, the system has already decided something important. This child must be made legible to the state. That is the real hinge of the story. A private birth becomes a public record, and a living child becomes a file entry. And once that shift happened, it never stayed limited to health officials. The same record could support taxes, schools, rationing, and military service. This is why critics keep returning to one uncomfortable idea. The certificate does not merely describe a birth, it creates an administratively useful person. If that sounds abstract, look at the practical chain. A certificate leads to an identity number, then to school enrollment, then to payroll, then to citizenship proofs. And once the state can follow that chain, the person is no longer just known by family, church, or neighborhood memory. The file becomes the authority. That is the quiet revolution hidden inside this topic. Not just record keeping, but a new hierarchy of who gets remembered by law. In that sense, birth certificates did not just reflect old world heritage. They helped replace local memory with centralized proof, one family at a time. Why did so many industrial countries move in the same direction so quickly? That question matters because the speed is harder to explain than the policy itself. Some historians would point to bureaucracy, urban growth, or public health reform. But the deeper pattern is how fast the record became universal law, and that universality is what makes the topic unsettling. Different nations, different laws, yet the same administrative instinct arrived almost everywhere. Around the turn of the century, the United States began building a national birth registration standard. At first, it was voluntary and incomplete. Then the standards hardened. A birth district, compliance targets, and state-by-state acceptance rules turned the certificate into infrastructure rather than paperwork. The timeline is striking. In just a few decades, a patchwork of local practices became a near-total national system with very little public resistance visible. That silence is part of the mystery. Big systems usually provoke argument, yet the certificate moved forward with almost clinical calm. And then came the companion systems, taxation, draft records, pensions, schooling, and later social security. The certificate sat beneath them all. So the question is not whether the document mattered. It is whether the document quietly became the hinge on which modern bureaucracy turned. Because once identity is written into a file, it can be copied, verified, indexed, and demanded anywhere. That is power, even when it looks harmless. Some researchers argue that this is exactly how older heritage systems were displaced, not by one dramatic decree, but by administrative habits that never stopped expanding. No grand announcement was needed. The system simply kept receiving the next form, the next number, the next proof, until the old way of belonging was gone. And that is why the topic still matters today. If the first record can define the citizen, then every later record inherits that original authority. That inherited authority is what made birth certificates so durable. Even when the stated purpose changed, the machinery remained, and the paperwork kept ruling. But once a system learns how to define who exists on paper, it rarely stops there. So when we ask what erased old world heritage, the answer may not be one single act. It may be the slow replacement of inherited belonging with state-issued identity, one form, one permit, one approval at a time. And that same logic can quietly spread into every corner of public life. And that leaves one final question hanging in the air. If a birth certificate could quietly reshape a civilization, what other modern document began as a simple rule and grew into a kind of invisible gatekeeper? Some questions do not end with an answer. They lead to the next layer,